Venezuela has the largest proven oil reserves on Earth, more than Saudi Arabia, more than Russia. Beneath its soil sits an energy reserve so vast that, on paper, it should guarantee wealth for generations. And yet, at its lowest point, Venezuela struggled to produce enough fuel to keep its own economy running. That contradiction isn't a footnote. It isn't an anomaly. It's the story. This is not a video about socialism versus capitalism. It isn't about foreign plots, secret control, or hidden hands. And it isn't about a single leader or a single election. It's about what happens when a country builds its entire system around one source of easy money and slowly forgets how to run everything else. For most of modern history, governments have faced the same constraint. Running a country is expensive. Schools, infrastructure, courts, defense, none of it is cheap. And the only sustainable way to pay for it is to tax a productive population. Taxes are unpopular, but they serve a purpose. They force negotiation. They create feedback loops. They tie the survival of the state to the health of the economy beneath it. If businesses fail, tax revenue falls. If wages stagnate, consumption slows. If citizens suffer, governments feel it directly. That friction is uncomfortable. But it's also stabilizing. It forces governments to care whether the economy is working, because their revenue depends on it. Expansion, taxation versus rent mechanics. In a tax-based system, governments must constantly observe the economy. They need to know who is working, who is producing, where value is being created, and how money is moving through society. That requires institutions, tax agencies, courts, property records, contract enforcement. It requires legibility, the ability to see the economy clearly enough to collect from it. And because citizens are the source of revenue, they have leverage. They complain, they resist, they vote, they negotiate. That tension is messy, but it keeps the system responsive. A rent-based system works differently. When most government revenue comes from a single natural resource, the state no longer needs to understand the full economy. It only needs to manage extraction. The population doesn't fund the state. The state funds the population. At first, this feels like a gift, but over time, it changes incentives. Economic productivity becomes optional. Institutional maintenance becomes secondary. And accountability weakens, not because anyone planned it, but because the system no longer requires it. Oil changes that relationship completely. When revenue comes straight from the ground, the government no longer needs a broad, productive tax base. It doesn't need diversified industry, and it doesn't need to bargain with its citizens in the same way. Economists have a word for systems built like this. They're called petrostates. But the word matters less than the mechanism. When revenue comes from extraction instead of taxation, the state stops being a negotiator and becomes a distributor. Instead of collecting money from millions of economic actors, the government collects it from a single source and decides how it gets handed out. That single shift quietly rewires the entire system. This didn't begin as a failure. In 1976, Venezuela nationalized its oil industry. The state oil company, PDVSA, was created to manage production and exports. At the time, it worked. PDVSA was professionally run, technocratic, globally respected. It partnered with international firms, reinvested in infrastructure, and generated enormous revenue for the state. For decades, Venezuela looked like a model petrostate, wealthy, stable, and operationally competent. This matters because it means the outcome wasn't inevitable. Nationalization itself didn't break the system. The incentives built around it did. As oil revenue flowed directly into government hands, something subtle began to change. Oil money started replacing the need for everything else. Why build a complex tax system when oil rents cover the budget? Why encourage private industry when the state controls the primary revenue source? Why tolerate political friction when distribution can be centralized? Over time, the economy outside oil began to shrink. Manufacturing weakened. Agriculture declined. Small businesses struggled to compete with a state flush with cash. Not because people stopped working, but because the system stopped needing them. The state no longer depended on productivity. It depended on output. And output came from oil. To understand why this mattered, you have to understand how oil production actually works. Oil production is not a faucet you can turn on and off. It's a pressure system. Fields require constant monitoring. Refineries require regular maintenance. Pipelines degrade whether they're used or not. Most national oil companies plan decades ahead. They invest not for next year's revenue, but for output 10 or 20 years down the line. That discipline only works when production is treated as the priority. When PDVSA began shifting from an operator to a political instrument, those rhythms broke. Maintenance budgets were cut quietly. Reinvestment was delayed. Experienced engineers were replaced with loyal administrators. None of this caused immediate collapse, which is what made it so dangerous. The system still produced, just less efficiently. Problems accumulated out of sight, and the cost of fixing them rose every year they were ignored. The real turning point came when the oil company itself stopped operating like a company. PDVSA began to shift from an operational institution into a political instrument. Leadership loyalty mattered more than technical competence. Revenue distribution mattered more than reinvestment. And long-term maintenance gave way to short-term control. In the early 2000s, that shift became irreversible. A major strike inside PDVSA was followed by mass firings. Engineers, geologists, managers, institutional memory were removed. These weren't abstract losses. They were the people who knew how fields behaved under pressure, how refineries aged, how complex systems failed, and how to prevent it. This wasn't sabotage from below, it was a change in incentives from above. When the primary goal becomes distribution instead of production, the system optimizes for visibility, not durability. Spending is seen, maintenance is not. Reinvestment pays off later, political loyalty pays off now. Oil production doesn't collapse overnight, it degrades quietly. Maintenance schedules stretch, equipment ages. Small failures go unrepaired. Expertise leaves and isn't replaced. For a time, production continues anyway, because oil fields are forgiving till they aren't. And in Venezuela's case, the challenge was even greater. Much of its oil is heavy crude. It requires more processing, more specialized equipment, more continuous investment just to keep flowing. Heavy crude doesn't tolerate neglect. When reinvestment stops, these fields don't gently decline. They seize up. Restarting them isn't like flipping a switch. It requires capital, expertise, and time, the very things the system had already sacrificed. This is where the feedback loop locks in. Oil funds the state. The state crowds out the rest of the economy. The non-oil economy shrinks. Oil becomes even more essential. Now watch one full cycle. Production slips slightly. Revenue falls. The government still has obligations, wages, subsidies, services. So instead of cutting spending, it pulls more from the oil company. That means less reinvestment. Less reinvestment leads to further production decline, which leads to less revenue, which leads to even more pressure on the oil sector. Each turn of the loop weakens the system. A diversified economy absorbs shocks. A mono-resource economy amplifies them. Petrostates don't bend under pressure, they crack. By the time external pressure entered the picture, the system was already brittle. Sanctions, export restrictions, and financial barriers didn't create Venezuela's fragility. They exposed it. They worked by limiting who could buy, finance, insure, or transport Venezuelan oil. A pressure architecture that only works when a system has no redundancy. In a diversified economy, pressure forces adaptation. Capital shifts. Industries adjust. In a rent-based system, pressure removes the only pillar holding everything up. That pressure didn't arrive in a vacuum. It arrived through export controls, licensing restrictions, and financial choke points. The modern tools states use when systems are already fragile. External pressure accelerated the timeline. It didn't write the script. The collapse was structural, not sudden. This is why Venezuela's story keeps resurfacing. Not because it's unique, but because it's clarifying. It shows what happens when easy money replaces institutional discipline. When revenue becomes detached from productivity. When systems are optimized for control instead of resilience. Oil didn't fail Venezuela. The system built around it did. Venezuela isn't a morality tale. It's a blueprint, a diagram of incentives that appear wherever governments rely on concentrated rents instead of broad economic participation. The paradox at the center of it remains unresolved. How can a country sitting on the world's largest oil reserves struggle to function? The answer isn't hidden underground. It's embedded in the structure above it. So the real question isn't what went wrong in Venezuela. It's how many modern economies are closer to this model than they realize. And what happens when their own easy money starts to run out. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.